I never thought that a simple visit to my dad's old friend would stir up so many feelings inside me. I mean, David had always been this larger-than-life figure growing up. He was the kind of guy who radiated confidence effortlessly, always cracking jokes with this deep, hearty laugh that just filled the room. I remember hanging around him when I was younger, maybe too much. I was 18 the last time I saw him, and back then, I didn't fully understand why I was always drawn to him. But now, things were different. I was different. At 22, I've come to accept who I am, embrace it even. I'm gay, and it feels good to finally say that without hesitation. But it also means that seeing people from my past, people I had weird, complicated feelings about, hits a lot harder. And David? Well, let's just say he's more than just some old friend now. I hadn't seen him in 4 years, and when my dad, John, mentioned that we were stopping by David's house today, I jumped at the opportunity. Yeah, maybe a little too enthusiastically. David always had this effortless, rugged kind of charm that I didn't really understand back then. But now, oh, I get it. His dark hair always looked perfectly messy, his sharp jawline, the way he carried himself with that easy confidence. It all made sense to me now. And I couldn't deny it anymore. David was handsome as hell. The thought of seeing him again, this time as someone who finally understood his own feelings, was a mix of excitement and nervous energy. The idea of going to David's house was oddly exciting. Maybe it was the familiarity, or maybe it was the fact that I could finally see him in a new light, through the eyes of someone who knew they liked men. Either way, the moment my dad mentioned it, I was already halfway out the door, pretending it was just a casual trip. But inside, I knew it was more than that. This was a chance to see him again. The man I had always admired, just in a different way now. The drive to David's house felt like it took forever, even though it was only about 30 minutes away. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, my mind racing. I hadn't seen David since I was 18, but I still remembered every little detail about him. His voice, his smile, the way he used to ruffle my hair whenever he and my dad would hang out. Back then, I had no idea why I liked being around him so much, but now it was crystal clear. Seeing him again, knowing that I was openly gay now, made my stomach twist in knots. Part of me felt like I was stepping into dangerous territory, but another part of me was excited, like I was about to revisit an old crush I never knew I had. We'd pulled up to David's house, which was just as I remembered it. A cozy 2-story place tucked away in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It had this laid-back, welcoming vibe, just like David himself. The front yard was well kept, with a couple of garden chairs on the porch, and the windows were wide open, letting in the autumn breeze. The air smelled like cut grass and the faint scent of a barbecue from somewhere down the street. Everything about it felt comforting, familiar, but at the same time, it sent a jolt of anticipation through me. I couldn't wait to see him again, to feel that rush of excitement when we finally stood face to face after all these years. My dad, John, parked the car and started rummaging around in the backseat, muttering something about needing to fix a loose wire or cable before heading in. I wasn't really paying attention though. My eyes were glued to the house, and before I even realized it, I was already halfway out of the car, eager to get inside. "I'll be there in a minute," my dad said, his voice distant as he bent over the car engine. "Go ahead and say hi to David." It was exactly what I wanted to hear. I nodded, not even waiting for him to look up. I made my way up the stone path to the front door, feeling this bubbling excitement in my chest. I wasn't planning on knocking. I wanted to surprise him, catch him off guard, just like old times. It felt like a small, playful thing to do, something a bit mischievous, something David would get a kick out of. Besides, my dad and David were close enough that we practically had free reign of each other's homes. It wasn't weird, right? It's not like I was breaking any rules. I twisted the doorknob and stepped inside. The house was warm, cozy, and exactly how I remembered it, though a bit quieter than usual. The familiar scent of wood polish and faint cologne lingered in the air, the kind that instantly brought back memories of sitting in the living room, listening to my dad and David banter back and forth over beers and football games. But today, the house was silent. No TV blaring in the background, no clattering from the kitchen, just the faint sound of water running somewhere upstairs. I smiled to myself, guessing David was probably getting ready for the day. I decided not to call out his name, wanting to keep the surprise intact. The idea of catching him off guard was thrilling for some reason, probably more than it should have been. I could feel my heart beating a little faster as I walked quietly through the hallway, my shoes making soft thuds on the wooden floor. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed the sound of running water had stopped. I figured he was probably just finishing up in the shower, and that's when I made my way toward the bedroom at the far end of the hallway. But as I approached the door, something caught my eye. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, steam still billowing out from inside, and before I could even think about turning away, I saw him. David was standing there, dripping wet, just stepping out of the shower with nothing but a white towel loosely wrapped around his waist. His skin glistened, water droplets catching the soft light from the bathroom, highlighting every curve of muscle on his toned, athletic body. His chest was broad, with a light dusting of hair, and his arms looked strong, defined, more muscular than I remembered. His dark hair was damp, sticking to his forehead, and as he raised his hand to push it back, I couldn't help but stare. He looked incredible. So different from the last time I saw him, more mature, more rugged. He was no longer just my dad's friend. He was a man, and standing there, half naked, he looked like someone out of a dream. My mouth went dry, and for a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen, unable to move. I knew I should have looked away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to him, taking in every inch of his body, every detail. I didn't know what I was expecting when I came up here, but it definitely wasn't this. "Jeremy?" His deep voice snapped me out of my daze, and I quickly realized that I had been caught staring. My face flushed hot with embarrassment, and I tore my eyes away from his body, fumbling for words. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." I blurted out, my heart racing. "I didn't mean to, I didn't know." David just chuckled, his voice low and amused, and to my surprise, he didn't seem the least bit bothered. If anything, he looked slightly amused by my reaction, his lips quirking up into a playful smile. "It's fine," he said, casually tightening the towel around his waist. Guess I wasn't expecting company so soon. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I could feel them travel over me, like he was sizing me up in a way I hadn't noticed before. My stomach flipped, but I quickly brushed it off, shaking my head. "Really, I'm sorry, I was just, Dad's still outside, fixing the car or something. He told me to come in, I didn't mean to." I trailed off, feeling like I was making it worse with every word. "No harm done, kid," David replied with a grin, his tone still light and teasing. "It's good to see you again. You've grown up a lot since the last time I saw you." His eyes flicked down to my body for just a second before he turned back toward the bathroom. I could still feel my heart pounding in my chest as I quickly excused myself and made my way back downstairs, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The way his eyes had looked at me, the way he smiled. It felt like there was something more behind it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. By the time my dad finally made it inside, he was on the phone, grumbling about work. Apparently, there was some kind of emergency, and despite being on vacation, his boss was calling him in. I could hear the frustration in his voice as he apologized to David for cutting the visit short, but David just waved it off, saying it wasn't a big deal. I, on the other hand, was quietly relieved. As soon as my dad left, I found myself alone with David. The house suddenly felt quieter, more intimate, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. With my dad gone, the atmosphere in David's house shifted. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavier, more intimate. I felt the weight of being alone with him settle over me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I tried to shake off the nerves by cracking open a beer, offering one to David, who was now dressed in casual clothes, just a simple pair of jeans and a plain, tight-fitting shirt that still hinted at the muscular frame beneath. My mind kept flashing back to the sight of him wrapped in that towel, wet from the shower, and I knew I had to focus on something else before I drove myself crazy. We settled into the living room, sinking into the soft, worn couch that faced the TV. David turned on some background noise, a random game show I wasn't paying attention to, and we started drinking. The beer was cold, refreshing, and it took the edge off the weird tension I felt creeping in. The first couple of sips made it easier to relax, and before long, we were both stretched out on the couch, legs up, leaning back, and just talking like old times. Only, it wasn't really like old times. There was something different now, something unspoken hanging between us. We talked about life. I told him about college, about work, and how things had been going for me in general. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, and then he started sharing bits of his own life over the past few years. It was strange, hearing him talk so openly about things, his job, his travels, the relationships that didn't work out. He was still the same David I remembered, but there was a vulnerability in the way he spoke that I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was the beers, maybe it was the years that had passed, or maybe it was just being alone, but something about the conversation felt more real, more personal than ever. At one point, the conversation turned to relationships. I knew it was inevitable. He joked about how I must have a fiancé by now, or at least be dating someone, and I could feel my heart rate spike a little. I hesitated, took a long swig of my beer, and then decided to be honest. There was no reason to hide it anymore, so I told him. I told him I was gay. The words left my mouth and hung in the air for a moment, and I braced myself for his reaction, not sure what to expect. But instead of surprise or judgment, there was this strange sense of understanding in his eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't make it weird. If anything, he seemed almost relieved. Then, in a quiet, matter-of-fact way, he told me that he had come to the same realization about himself over the past few years. That admission hung between us like a secret we were finally free to share. It felt liberating, like this huge weight had been lifted off my chest, and suddenly, everything made sense. The way he'd looked at me earlier, the way the conversation had taken on this new level of intimacy. I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement at his words. The fact that David, the man I had always admired, had even secretly fantasized about, was not only gay, but had also noticed me in a way I never would have expected, made my head spin. The way he casually mentioned it, like it was no big deal, yet his eyes told a different story. His gaze lingered on me, and for the first time, I could feel a shift in the way he looked at me, not as some kid who used to hang around him and my dad, but as a man, someone he found attractive. The compliment came soon after, slipping out in a way that felt both casual and intentional. He told me I was handsome. Hearing those words from him was like a spark to a fire I didn't even realize was there. My pulse quickened, and suddenly, the space between us on the couch felt too wide. I could feel the energy between us change, becoming something thicker, more charged. It was subtle at first, just a lingering glance, a slight brush of the arm as he reached for his beer. But it was there, undeniable, and I knew he felt it too. As the conversation continued, I became bolder. Maybe it was the beer loosening my inhibitions, or maybe it was the fact that we were both finally being honest with ourselves, but I found myself leaning closer to him, my hand resting casually on his knee. At first, it was innocent enough, just a friendly gesture, the kind that could be easily explained away if needed. But when I didn't move it, and he didn't either, something shifted. The tension between us built slowly, but steadily, like an electric current running through the air. I could feel the warmth of his body next to mine, and the more we talked, the more my hand seemed to gravitate toward him. There was no sudden moment of realization. It was more like a slow, inevitable progression, as though both of us knew where this was heading, but neither wanted to be the first to make the move. My hand inched upward, sliding from his knee to his thigh, resting there for a moment as I felt the muscle tense slightly beneath my fingers. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest as I tested the waters, my gaze flicking up to his face to see how he would react. But David didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned in slightly, his breath coming a little slower, his eyes darkening with something I hadn't seen before. The next few seconds were a blur. My hand continued to slide up, moving almost on its own, until it reached the waistband of his jeans. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric. My fingers hesitated for a brief moment, but then, as if something inside me snapped, I slipped my hand inside. Everything after that became a blur of sensation. The way his body responded to my touch, the way the air seemed to thicken with desire, the way my heart pounded in my ears, it all felt surreal. There was no going back now. David didn't push me away. In fact, he leaned into it, his breath hitching slightly as I explored further. It felt electric, the heat between us growing with every second. I could feel my own pulse quickening, the adrenaline coursing through me as I pressed my hand deeper, feeling the outline of him hardening under my touch. The tension between us had transformed into something physical, something primal. Neither of us spoke, and we didn't need to. The silence between us was heavy, loaded with meaning, with all the things we weren't saying but both clearly understood. He shifted slightly on the couch, his body responding to my movements, and before I knew it, his hand was on mine, guiding me, urging me to go further. The sensation of his hand over mine, his skin hot and rough, sent a shiver through me. I couldn't believe this was happening, that after all these years of seeing David as just my dad's friend, we had somehow crossed into this territory. But it felt right, like something we had both been waiting for without even realizing it. I leaned closer to him, the space between us disappearing entirely as our bodies pressed together. I could smell the faint hint of his cologne mixed with the natural scent of his skin, still slightly damp from the shower. His chest was rising and falling faster now, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts as I continued exploring him. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the heat of our combined desire, and it was as if nothing else in the world existed outside of that moment. At some point, I don't even remember when, we both moved without thinking. 1 second, I was touching him through his jeans, and the next, we were fumbling, desperate, our hands pulling at clothing, peeling off layers. His shirt was off first, tossed carelessly onto the floor, revealing the broad expanse of his chest, muscular and defined in a way that sent another wave of heat rushing through me. My fingers traced the lines of his body, feeling every ridge, every curve of muscle, and I couldn't get enough. My own shirt was gone soon after, and the feeling of his bare skin against mine was overwhelming. His hands were on me now, rough and insistent, exploring my chest, my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. I could feel every part of him, his body pressed tightly against mine, the hardness of his arousal against my thigh, the heat radiating off him. It was intense, raw, unlike anything I had ever felt before. Somehow, in the haze of it all, we made our way to the bedroom, stumbling and laughing softly as we tore at the rest of our clothes. I wasn't sure who was leading who anymore. It was all a blur of hands, mouths, and skin, and by the time we fell onto the bed, there was no turning back. The weight of him on top of me, his body pressing me into the mattress, was intoxicating. I could feel his need, his desire, and it matched my own. The way he touched me was both rough and tender at the same time, as if he had been holding back for years and was finally letting it all out. There was no awkwardness between us now, no hesitation. Everything felt natural, like this was exactly what we were meant to be doing. His hands were everywhere, on my chest, sliding down my stomach, pulling at my hips as he positioned himself between my legs. I could feel the heat of his breath on my neck, his lips brushing against my skin as he kissed his way down my body, leaving a trail of fire in his wake. And then it happened. The moment we crossed that final line, when there was no more thinking, just pure physical connection. It wasn't slow, it wasn't gentle, it was desperate, hungry, like we had both been waiting for this for far too long. The sensation of him inside me was overwhelming, a mix of pleasure and pain that sent my mind spiraling. I gasped, my body arching up to meet his, and he groaned in response, his hands gripping my hips tightly as he thrust deeper. The bed creaked beneath us, the room filled with the sounds of our bodies moving together, the soft gasps and moans that escaped our lips as we lost ourselves in each other. Every movement felt like it sent shockwaves through my body, every touch igniting something deep inside me that I hadn't known was there. It was intense, raw, and unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I felt connected to him in a way that went beyond just the physical. It was like our bodies were speaking a language all their own, one that didn't need words. For a few moments, neither of us moved. We just lay there, tangled together, our bodies slick with sweat, our breathing heavy and uneven. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I could feel his racing too, the rise and fall of his chest pressed against mine. There was a strange sense of calm that settled over us, a quiet after the storm. It was almost surreal, lying there with him, our bodies still intertwined, knowing that we had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Eventually, David rolled off me, collapsing onto the bed beside me with a satisfied sigh. I turned my head to look at him, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was exhilarated, still riding the high of what had just happened, while another part of me was already starting to process the gravity of it all. What did this mean for us? For my dad? for the years of friendship that had just been turned upside down in a single night. But as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of David's body next to mine, I couldn't bring myself to worry about any of that. Not yet, anyway. For now, all I could think about was how right it had felt, how intense and alive I had felt in that moment with him. Whatever happened next, we'd figure it out. But for now, I was content to just be here in this moment with him. And as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning of something much bigger. And I was right. That night marked the beginning of our relationship. I literally fell in love. I didn't care that David was almost 3 times older than me. I felt good, and I secretly went to him. One evening, I was sitting at home, scrolling aimlessly through my phone when I got a notification. It was a message from him. Just his name lighting up my screen was enough to send a rush through me. But then, as quickly as it came, the message disappeared. Deleted. My mind raced, wondering if he'd meant to send it, if it was a mistake, or if he changed his mind at the last second. The uncertainty gnawed at me, but it only took a second before I decided I couldn't just sit there wondering. I threw on my jacket and headed out, heart pounding the whole way to his place. It was dark, and the streets had that late evening quiet to them where everything feels almost too still. When I got to his door, I barely had time to knock before he opened it. There he stood, t-shirt slightly rumpled, eyes wide with surprise. But before either of us could say a word, I stepped inside and closed the small gap between us. I don't know who moved first. It was like we just collided into each other, lips pressing hard, breath mingling in a way that felt both desperate and familiar. The door hadn't even clicked shut behind me before his hands were on me, sliding down my back and gripping my waist. I let out this sound, something between a sigh and a gasp, as I felt his fingers press into my skin. The warmth of his touch, the way he knew just how to hold me, it was all-consuming. I reached for the hem of his t-shirt, tucking it up and over his head, breaking the kiss only for the briefest moment. I let it drop somewhere behind us, not caring where it landed. My lips found their way to his neck, tracing that line of skin from his jaw to his collarbone. I could feel him shiver, his breathing turning ragged as my mouth moved lower, tasting the faint salt of his skin, the familiar scent that I'd come to crave. "God, you're something else," he murmured, his voice low and rough. The sound of it made something tighten in my chest, a mix of pride and desire. I looked up at him, catching the way his eyes were darkened, pupils blown wide as he watched me. There was no hesitation in the way he looked at me, just want, pure and unfiltered. I dropped to my knees without thinking, my hands running down the planes of his torso, feeling the way his muscles tensed under my touch. The anticipation was thick, and the sound of his breathing was like a steady beat, guiding me. It felt different this time, more intense, like we'd crossed some kind of invisible line, and there was no going back. I wanted him to feel everything I felt, every rush, every pulse of heat that ran through me when we were like this. The room was quiet except for the sounds we made, the ragged breaths, the subtle creaks of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. It was just us, caught up in this moment that felt like it could last forever. His hands were in my hair, gentle but firm, and I looked up at him, catching that half smile that said more than any words could. When I stood up again, his arms pulled me against him, and we just stood there for a second, foreheads touching, breathing the same air. It was one of those moments where time kind of blurs, and everything outside of that little space we occupied seemed to fall away. I felt his fingers trail down my back, tugging at my shirt until it joined the growing pile of clothes at our feet. The warmth of his skin pressed against mine was something I'd never get tired of. "You know you're driving me crazy, right?" he whispered, and I couldn't help the grin that tugged at my lips. He leaned in, kissing me softer this time, taking his time like we weren't in any rush. It felt different from the first time, a little deeper, more sure. It was like we both knew exactly where we stood now, and we weren't afraid to show it. We stayed there for a long time, the room slowly cooling as the night went on. He ran his fingers through my hair, a content sigh leaving his lips as he looked down at me. There was no need for words in that moment, no explanations or promises, just the weight of the night settling over us, grounding us in that small, shared space. "I think I'm going to fall in love with you," I said softly, the words slipping out before I could second-guess them. For a second, I worried I'd said too much, but then his eyes crinkled at the corners. and he leaned in, brushing his lips against mine in a kiss that felt like an answer. "I already have," he whispered back, and that was enough. More than enough. That night was a whole different level. It's crazy how quickly things escalated from a message on my phone to standing in his hallway, the air between us charged with tension. I barely remember how we made it inside without tripping over ourselves, but I remember the feel of him against me, his mouth hungry on mine, his hands everywhere, like he couldn't touch enough at once. And then suddenly, he turned me around, pressing me against the wall with those strong arms of his. There was no space left between us. I felt the coolness of the wall on my front and the warmth of him on my back. His lips found the curve of my neck, trailing kisses down my shoulder, then lower. Every touch sent a jolt through me. I could feel my heart racing, my skin heating up to the point I was sure I must be red from head to toe. He paused for just a second, almost like he was checking in, making sure I was right there with him. And I was. More than ready. It was like we both took a breath at the same time, a moment where the world seemed to stand still before he pressed forward, gentle at first, like he was testing the waters. A shiver ran down my spine, moving at a steady pace that had my knees threatening to give out. His grip on my waist tightened, keeping me upright, and all I could do was lean into him, my head tilting back just enough to catch my breath. I don't know if it was the angle or the tension that had been building between us all week, but I swear every nerve ending I had was on fire. It was more than just physical. It felt almost electric, like we were syncing up to the same rhythm. And when he started to pick up the pace, that's when everything got more intense. My fingers were pressing against the wall, trying to find anything to hold on to while he held me steady, his breath coming in short, hot bursts against my skin. I couldn't form words. All that came out were these quiet gasps, half-laughs, the kind of noises that happen when you're so caught up in the moment that you forget to care how you sound. I could feel how much he was into it, the way his grip on my hips kept tightening, pulling me back against him with every move. There was nothing else but the two of us, the rough edge of the wall biting into my palms, and the heat that seemed to roll off both of us in waves. He stilled for just a second, the air thick around us, and I felt that rush of relief, like the tension just melted out of both of us. For a few beats, it was silent except for our breathing, heavy and uneven. Before I even had time to gather myself, he wrapped his arms around me from behind, pulling me close. I felt the strength of him as he lifted me, my legs almost giving out as I half laughed, half caught my breath. He carried me over to the sofa, laying me down before settling in next to me, his body pressed against mine. We were both a mess, sweaty, hair tousled, chests heaving, but in the best way. I reached up to run my fingers through his hair, which was sticking up in all directions, and he chuckled, this deep sound that made me smile. His hand rested on my waist as he leaned down, pressing a softer, more lingering kiss to my lips. It was the kind of kiss that felt lazy, like we had all the time in the world. When he pulled back, he looked at me with this expression that I couldn't quite describe, part affection, part exhaustion, part something deeper. "That was incredible," he said, his voice low, still a bit rough from earlier. "You know, your energy, it's like, it brings me back to life." I couldn't help but grin at that. It felt good hearing that, knowing I was part of whatever it was that made him feel this way. I traced small circles on his chest with my fingertips, feeling the rise and fall as he caught his breath. We didn't need to say much after that. We just lay there, the room still carrying the heat of what just happened, tangled up together with the quiet settling around us. There was no rush to move, no urge to fill the silence with words that weren't needed. Just the sound of our breathing and the steady thump of his heartbeat under my ear as I lay against him. And for that moment, everything felt right, like the world outside didn't matter and we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Waking up next to David the next morning was a kind of surreal moment that I don't think I'll ever forget. You know that feeling when you wake up and for a split second, you're disoriented, not sure where you are? But then it hits you and you remember, and this warmth just spreads through you. That's exactly how it felt. The early morning light was filtering through the curtains, casting this soft glow over the room. I opened my eyes and saw him next to me, still asleep, breathing slow and steady, and it just made me smile. It felt like this weird mix of comfort and excitement, like waking up and immediately being reminded that something really good just happened. I didn't want to move at first. I just lay there, taking in the little things. The way his chest rose and fell, the slight scruff on his jaw that made him look even more rugged in the morning, and how his arm was still draped across my waist like he'd held me all night without letting go. There was something grounding about it, and I couldn't help but let out this quiet sigh of contentment. Eventually he stirred, eyes blinking open before he turned to look at me. He had this lazy smile that stretched across his face, the kind that made it look like he was still half dreaming. "Morning," he said, voice all raspy and deeper than usual. It did something to me, hearing him like that. I grinned back and leaned over to kiss him, just a quick brush of lips, but it was enough to spark that familiar heat between us. "Want a shower?" he asked after a beat, eyes crinkling with that playful glint I'd started to recognize. It wasn't a question so much as an invitation, and I nodded, already feeling a rush of anticipation. We got up, still a bit groggy and moving slow, and made our way to the bathroom. The tiles were cold underfoot, a stark contrast to the warm, humid air that lingered from the summer morning outside. He turned on the water, letting it run until steam started to fill the space. The sound of the water hitting the tile was kind of soothing, a constant backdrop to the quiet moments that hung between us. When we stepped under the spray, it was hot enough to make my skin tingle, waking me up more with each second. David moved in close, standing behind me as the water cascaded over both of us. I felt his hands slide up my sides, gentle at first, fingertips tracing patterns that made me shiver even though the water was hot. His lips found the curve of my shoulder, pressing soft kisses that slowly traveled up to the nape of my neck. It was one of those moments where you're aware of every tiny detail, the heat of the water running over our bodies, the slick feeling of skin against skin, the way his breath felt warm on my wet skin. I tilted my head back slightly, meeting his gaze over my shoulder. The look in his eyes was enough to make my heart stutter in my chest. We turned to face each other, and I reached up to pull him in for a kiss. It started slow, unhurried, but it didn't stay that way for long. His hands were in my hair, fingers tangled and gripping just enough to make me want more. The water kept running over us, but I barely noticed it anymore, too caught up in the way he pressed against me, the way he tasted and the sounds he made when I kissed him just right. It wasn't long before things got more intense, touches turning more deliberate, breathing heavier. The shower was small, and it felt like there was barely enough space for both of us, but that only made it better, made us press even closer. It was hot and steamy in every sense of the word, and every touch, every movement felt magnified by the heat and the water surrounding us. His hands on me, my hands on him, it was like everything else melted away, and it was just us, caught up in this moment that felt like it could go on forever. When we finally stepped out, skin flushed, and the mirror fogged up completely, we were both laughing, a little breathless, but in that good way. I wrapped a towel around myself and glanced over at him as he did the same. There was this content look on his face that made my heart do that stupid flutter thing. I leaned over and kissed him again, quick this time, but just as meaningful. He caught my hand and squeezed it, a small, silent gesture that felt more intimate than any words. We made our way to the kitchen, still in our towels, hair damp and sticking up in different directions. It was a scene that probably looked ridiculous, but I loved it. David started making coffee, the rich smell filling the air and blending with the leftover steam clinging to our skin. I busied myself with pulling together something simple for breakfast: toast, eggs, whatever was in the fridge. It wasn't fancy, but it felt perfect. While we waited for the coffee to brew, he came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a kiss to my temple. It was small moments like that, the quiet gestures, that really got to me. It wasn't just about the big, passionate moments, it was about these little bits of normalcy that made it feel real. We sat at the kitchen table, plates in front of us, mugs of coffee steaming between our hands. The conversation was light, full of teasing comments and laughs. He mentioned something about how my hair was sticking up on one side, and I made a face at him, which only made him laugh harder. It was easy, comfortable, like we'd been doing this for years instead of just days. At one point, he reached across the table and brushed a thumb over my cheek, his expression softening. "You know," he said, "I didn't realize how much I needed this. Just everything." I felt my face heat up, but not from embarrassment. It was that warm, settled feeling that comes when someone you care about says something that just hits you in the right place. I didn't need to say anything back. The look I gave him said it all. When I got home around noon, it felt like the whole world had shifted and I was the only one who noticed. It was probably a Saturday or Sunday, but I didn't really care. The weekend noise outside was in full swing. Kids were yelling, a lawnmower was going somewhere down the street, and a neighbor's dog barked nonstop. I walked up to the front door, still feeling the echoes of the morning with David, and it was enough to make me grin without realizing it. As I stepped inside, I saw my dad in the living room, a beer in his hand as he half-watched a game on TV. He turned when he heard me and gave me this look, raised eyebrow smirk, like he knew I'd had a night to remember. The energy in the room was light, casual, and he got up, crossing the space between us with his usual playful confidence. He gave me a friendly tap on the shoulder, a sign of approval or some sort of fatherly acknowledgement, then stepped back with an expression that told me he was up to something. I couldn't help but smile as he gestured for me to close my eyes and hold out my hand. It was one of his classic moves when he had something cheeky planned. When I opened my eyes, there it was, a pack of condoms resting in my palm. The message was clear, and I could tell by the look on his face that he was trying to play the cool, supportive dad role. He was acknowledging that I was growing up, maybe even thinking I was with someone he approved of, someone my age, someone uncomplicated. I laughed, maybe a little too hard. The irony was thick enough to choke on. If only he knew who I'd been with last night, who had been in my thoughts for days. It wasn't someone from school or a casual fling. It was David, my dad's best friend, his childhood buddy, the guy who'd been in our house countless times, sitting at our table, sharing stories about their youth. The guilt hit me in that moment, a fleeting but sharp reminder of how risky this was, how my actions could drag David into a mess he didn't deserve. Yet even that guilt couldn't wipe away the way I felt about him, the rush, the connection that felt too real to ignore. Dad turned back to the couch, satisfied that he'd done his fatherly duty. Meanwhile, I stuffed the pack of condoms into my pocket, feeling the weight of them more like a reminder than a gift. I made my way up the stairs, feeling my phone buzz before I reached my room. I glanced down at the screen. It was a text from David. Just seeing his name made my heart pick up, a small thrill running through me. The text was simple, but it said enough. He was thinking about last night, about me, and the idea of him on the other end of that message, replaying the same moments, made my grin return despite myself. I quickly typed back, my fingers moving before I could second-guess what I was saying. The message was short, but the meaning behind it was loud in my head. I felt a mix of excitement and something deeper, something that made everything else seem a little dull by comparison. Once the message sent, I dropped onto my bed, staring up at the familiar ceiling. The posters on my wall, the cluttered desk with school notes, and clothes piled up in the corner felt distant, like they belonged to another life. Everything had a layer of normalcy that didn't quite match up with how I felt. My room was the same, but nothing felt the same. I could still feel David's touch lingering on my skin, the way he looked at me that morning before we parted. It was all tangled up with that rush of breaking rules, of having something secret that no one else could touch. There was guilt, sure, lurking somewhere in the background. It was impossible not to think about how my dad would react if he ever found out, how betrayed he would feel, not just by me but by David. And even knowing that, even feeling the sharp edge of it, I couldn't make myself regret it. The thought of stopping, of pulling away from David, didn't sit right. If anything, it made me realize just how deep in I already was. So I let myself have that moment. I sank into the feeling of being on the edge of something thrilling and dangerous, knowing that for now, it was mine alone to navigate. It was messy, complicated, and bound to catch up to me eventually, but I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. It was a Saturday night. We decided on a cozy evening in because the week had been long for both of us, and all we really needed was some time to just chill. We were sprawled out on the couch, limbs kind of tangled but comfortable. It felt natural, you know? We weren't thinking too much about what came next, but there was this slow, building energy between us. There was this moment when he turned to me, eyes catching mine mid-sentence, and suddenly it was like everything else faded out. I can't even remember what we were talking about, I just remember the look on his face. And I know how this sounds, cheesy as hell, but sometimes you just have these moments that are seared into your memory. His smile shifted into something a little more knowing, a little more playful. And that was all it took. I leaned in and kissed him, feeling that familiar jolt that was like flipping a switch inside me. His lips were soft and warm, moving with mine in that way we'd gotten so used to, but that never got old. It started slow, but it didn't take long for things to get more heated. Hands started roaming, breaths getting shorter between kisses. We were still on the couch when I felt his hands on my hips, pulling me closer until I was practically straddling him. He let out this small laugh, and I could feel the vibration of it against my chest. It made me smile, but also just made me want him more. I pulled back just a bit, enough to look at him, and said, "Hey, tonight, I want to be on top." It came out more confident than I thought it would. I leaned back in, my fingers running through his hair, gripping just enough for him to tilt his head back a little. That's when I felt him relax under me, like he was giving over control completely. It sent a surge through me, a mix of feeling trusted and feeling wanted. Our kisses deepened, getting more intense, more desperate in the best way. He shifted under me, just slightly, enough to let me know he was as into it as I was. At some point, we moved to the bedroom, kind of clumsily because we were too caught up in each other to coordinate. We laughed when he almost tripped over the edge of the carpet, breaking the tension for a second, but we were right back at it in no time. The room was dimly lit, just enough so that I could see him looking up at me as I pushed him gently back onto the bed. I took a moment to just take in the scene. His hair was a little messy from my hands, and there was this look in his eyes. Half-lidded, a little dark, but full of anticipation. It was hard not to get lost in that, but I had my plan, and I wasn't going to overthink it. I climbed onto the bed, positioning myself over him. He reached up, fingertips skimming down my chest, sending a shiver through me. It was this weird mix of feeling both in control and vulnerable at the same time, and I could tell he felt the same. Our bodies pressed together, skin on skin, and there was this moment where time felt like it stretched out. We started moving in sync, finding that rhythm that made everything else disappear. I won't get into every single detail because, privacy and all that, but there was this point where I could feel his muscles tensing under me, and I knew he was close. I leaned back just a bit to see his face, the way his eyes squeezed shut for a second before locking onto mine, and that was it for both of us. Everything just crashed over us at once, like a wave. There was this heavy, electric silence afterward as we both caught our breath, my head resting on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow down. We stayed like that for a while, just tangled up, neither of us in a hurry to move. It wasn't about who had the upper hand or who was in charge. It was about being there, being close, and knowing we were exactly where we wanted to be. It was one of those nights that just stuck with me, reminding me how lucky I was to have found someone I could be completely open with, someone who trusted me enough to let go. If you're interested, in November 2024 we are still dating. In secret from everyone. It has been about 3 months. I don't know where this will lead, but I like it so much. And I wish you to find the same. Subscribe and see you tomorrow.